The first time I heard someone call me heartless, I was standing 3 feet away. My aunt said it loudly enough for everyone in the hospital waiting room to hear. She looked at me, shook her head, and told a stranger that I had abandoned my own mother during the hardest year of her life. No one questioned her. No one asked me if it was true. They simply looked at me with that mixture of disgust and pity reserved for people who fail their families. Within weeks, the story spread through relatives, neighbors, church friends, and even people I barely knew. According to them, I had disappeared when my mother needed me most. The worst part wasn't hearing strangers believe it. The worst part was watching my own mother slowly begin to believe it too. Every visit became colder. Every conversation shorter. Every attempt to explain myself seemed to make things worse. So eventually, I stopped defending myself. I stayed quiet while everyone decided who I was. They thought my silence was guilt. They thought I had no answer. What they didn't know was that a locked hospital file existed, and buried inside it was a timeline so precise, so undeniable, that it would eventually expose exactly who had been lying all along. I was 28 when my relationship with my mother began falling apart, and from the outside it looked like it was entirely my fault. My mother, Evelyn, had always been the steady center of our family. She was the person everyone called for advice, birthdays, emergencies, and celebrations. When she developed serious health problems after a sudden hospitalization, relatives immediately gathered around her. At first, I was grateful. I worked full-time as a project coordinator and lived almost 40 minutes away, so I believed having more people involved would help. Instead, something strange started happening. Information stopped reaching me. Appointments were changed without my knowledge. Decisions were made before I could participate. Whenever I asked questions, someone always had an explanation ready. My Aunt Diane usually answered for everyone, speaking with such confidence that challenging her felt impossible. Meanwhile, my mother became increasingly distant. Calls that once lasted an hour ended after 5 minutes. Invitations disappeared. Family gatherings felt uncomfortable in ways I couldn't explain. Then I started hearing rumors. People hinted that I wasn't helping. Others suggested I rarely visited. Some implied I only cared when it was convenient. Every accusation felt absurd because I knew exactly how much time, money, and effort I had invested trying to support my mother. Yet somehow, I was becoming the villain in a story I didn't even know was being written. The deeper my mother's health issues became, the more confusing everything around her started to feel. In the beginning, I assumed the communication problems were simple misunderstandings. Hospitals are stressful places. Families become overwhelmed. People forget details. That was the explanation I kept giving myself whenever I discovered an appointment had happened without me or learned about a medication change days after it occurred. My mother had authorized several relatives to help coordinate her care, and I believed everyone was working toward the same goal. But gradually, patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. One afternoon I arrived at the hospital after leaving work early, only to find my mother's room empty. A nurse casually mentioned she had already been transported for a specialist consultation. I was surprised because no one had informed me. When I called my Aunt Diane, she acted irritated rather than apologetic. She said the appointment had been arranged quickly and there hadn't been time to notify everyone. I accepted the explanation even though it didn't feel right. A week later, it happened again. Then again. Important updates always seemed to reach other relatives before they reached me. Family group messages suddenly became smaller conversations that excluded me. Decisions appeared fully formed before I even knew discussions had begun. Whenever I questioned it, Diane would smile sympathetically and remind everyone how busy I was with work. She said she was simply trying to reduce my stress. The statement sounded considerate on the surface, but it had a strange effect. It subtly reinforced the idea that I wasn't available, that I wasn't involved, that I couldn't be counted on. Over time, I noticed relatives repeating the same language. "We know you're busy. You already have so much on your plate. We didn't want to bother you." The words were always polite. The consequences were not. My mother began hearing those explanations too. During visits, she occasionally mentioned events I supposedly couldn't attend because I was working. The problem was that nobody had ever invited me. At first I corrected the misunderstandings gently. Then I started keeping records. Screenshots of messages. Calendar entries. Phone logs. Copies of emails. Not because I expected a confrontation, but because I felt like reality was slowly shifting around me. One evening my mother mentioned that Diane had spent an entire weekend handling insurance paperwork because I hadn't been available. I nearly dropped the cup of coffee I was holding. I had personally completed most of those forms and submitted them electronically. I remembered the hours clearly because I had stayed awake past midnight finishing everything before a deadline. When I explained that, my mother looked confused rather than convinced. She said Diane had told her something completely different. That conversation stayed with me for days. It wasn't just that someone had taken credit for work I had done. It was the realization that my mother trusted that version of events more than mine. After that, the atmosphere changed noticeably. Family gatherings became uncomfortable. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Relatives exchanged glances I couldn't interpret. At a birthday dinner, I overheard a cousin quietly asking another family member whether I had visited my mother recently. The answer came back immediately. Not much. I sat less than 10 feet away when those words were spoken. The truth was that I had visited 3 times that week. By then, frustration was beginning to compete with sadness. I wasn't losing arguments. I wasn't even being allowed into them. Someone was carefully shaping a narrative before I ever had the chance to respond. Still, I remained calm. I refused to create scenes. I refused to accuse anyone without proof. If there was one thing I understood, it was that emotional reactions would only make me look defensive. So I watched. I listened. I documented. And little by little, I started noticing something else. Every story that painted me as absent seemed to originate from the same person. Once I recognized that nearly every damaging story traced back to Diane, I started paying closer attention to the details she shared. What I found wasn't a single obvious lie but dozens of small distortions that became powerful when combined. She rarely made accusations directly. Instead, she framed everything as concern. She would sigh before speaking, lower her voice, and tell relatives she worried I was overwhelmed. She would mention that she hadn't seen me recently, conveniently leaving out the fact that she wasn't present during most of my visits. She never said I didn't care. She simply created enough doubt that other people reached that conclusion on their own. It was a strategy so subtle that confronting it felt nearly impossible. The more I observed, the more isolated I became. Family members who once called me regularly started communicating through Diane. If I offered information about my mother's treatment, someone would politely correct me with a version Diane had provided. It felt like competing against an unofficial spokesperson who somehow controlled the flow of information. The situation worsened when my mother was transferred to a rehabilitation facility after a lengthy hospital stay. Because the facility had stricter visitor procedures, communication became even more important. Yet somehow I continued learning critical updates after everyone else. One Friday afternoon I arrived carrying my mother's favorite soup, only to discover she had already been moved to a different wing earlier that day. The receptionist seemed surprised I didn't know. According to the records, several family contacts had been notified. My number was listed correctly, but I had received nothing. When I mentioned it to Diane, she immediately blamed an administrative mistake. It was always an administrative mistake. A scheduling error. A misunderstanding. A crossed communication line. Individually, each explanation sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming difficult to ignore. Around that time, my mother's attitude toward me changed more noticeably. She never became openly hostile, but there was a sadness in her voice that hadn't existed before. During one visit, she quietly asked why I seemed so distant lately. The question stunned me. I reminded her that I had visited several times that week. She looked genuinely confused. Then she mentioned specific days when she believed I hadn't come at all. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos we had taken together on those exact dates. For a moment she appeared shaken. Then she simply said she must have remembered incorrectly. The conversation ended, but the damage lingered. Someone had convinced my own mother that my presence was absence. As weeks passed, whispers turned into open judgment. Relatives stopped hiding their opinions. One cousin told me family was disappointed by how little I was helping. Another suggested I needed to reconsider my priorities. A longtime family friend pulled me aside after church and gently encouraged me to spend more time with my mother before it was too late. Listening to those comments felt surreal because they were describing a person who didn't exist. Meanwhile, I continued handling responsibilities no one seemed to acknowledge. I paid bills when deadlines approached. Coordinated transportation when schedules collapsed. Spoke with insurance representatives when claims were delayed. Whenever problems appeared, I quietly solved them. Yet somehow every visible act of support belonged to Diane in the public narrative. The breaking point came during a family gathering held at my mother's house several months later. A conversation about caregiving responsibilities turned unexpectedly toward me. One relative commented that Diane had practically carried the entire burden alone. Another agreed. Then someone else said they couldn't imagine abandoning a sick parent. The room fell silent. Nobody used my name, but everyone understood the target. I looked around and saw people avoiding eye contact. Some appeared uncomfortable. Others seemed convinced the accusation was deserved. Across the room, my mother sat quietly, saying nothing. That hurt more than any insult. For a few seconds I considered defending myself. I could have listed every appointment, every payment, every visit. Instead, I stayed calm. I thanked everyone for their concern and changed the subject. The reaction confused them. They expected anger. They expected denial. What they didn't realize was that I had already started uncovering inconsistencies that made no sense. And for the first time, I suspected the truth might be hiding somewhere much bigger than family gossip. The inconsistencies began revealing themselves in places nobody expected me to look. For months I had focused on conversations, rumors, and family dynamics, assuming the problem was purely personal. Then one routine phone call changed everything. I was speaking with an insurance representative about a delayed reimbursement claim when she referenced documentation I had never seen before. At first I thought she was discussing paperwork submitted by Diane, but the details didn't match anything I knew. After several careful questions, I learned that numerous medical communications had been directed through a designated family contact who wasn't always listed consistently across records. That discovery stayed with me. It wasn't proof of wrongdoing, but it suggested there was an administrative trail somewhere behind the confusion. Unlike family stories, administrative records didn't rely on memory or opinion. They relied on dates, signatures, logs, and documentation. I started requesting copies of every record I was legally permitted to review. The process took time. Forms had to be completed. Requests had to be approved. Some facilities responded quickly while others moved slowly. During those weeks, the accusations against me continued. Relatives became increasingly comfortable treating the rumors as facts. At one gathering, a family friend openly praised Diane for being the only person who had consistently stood beside my mother. The comment drew nods around the room. I smiled politely and said nothing. By then I had learned that truth often moves slower than gossip. What mattered was reaching it. Several weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in my mailbox. Inside were records from different stages of my mother's treatment. At first glance, everything looked routine. Admission forms. Communication logs. Care coordination notes. Transfer records. I spent an entire weekend reviewing them line by line. Most pages revealed nothing significant. Then I started noticing entries that didn't align with the stories I had been hearing for months. Certain dates showed documented contacts that contradicted claims relatives had repeated. Notes indicated communication attempts that had never reached me. Records reflected involvement levels that looked very different from the narrative circulating within the family. None of it provided a complete answer, but it pointed toward one location repeatedly referenced throughout the documentation: the hospital where my mother's treatment journey had begun. That hospital appeared connected to multiple communication decisions made during the earliest stages of her care. If the misunderstanding started anywhere, it likely started there. I requested additional records. More waiting followed. Meanwhile, Diane seemed unusually confident. In fact, her confidence grew stronger as time passed. She often spoke as though the story about me had already been permanently accepted. During one visit with my mother, Diane casually remarked that some people only show up when it benefits them. The comment was clearly directed at me. My mother looked uncomfortable but didn't challenge it. I simply smiled and continued helping arrange items on a bedside table. The calmer I remained, the bolder Diane became. She believed silence meant weakness. She never considered that silence could also mean preparation. Then came the phone call. A hospital administrator contacted me regarding one of my records requests. Her tone was professional but unusually careful. She explained that certain archived files required an in-person review because context mattered. The statement immediately caught my attention. Administrative staff rarely volunteered observations like that. We scheduled a meeting for the following week. I arrived carrying a folder of notes, expecting a routine discussion. Instead, the administrator greeted me with an expression that suggested she had already reviewed far more than I had. After leading me into a private office, she placed several documents on the table. She didn't make accusations. She didn't offer conclusions. She simply explained that hospitals maintain extensive communication histories for patient care coordination purposes. Then she pointed to a section of records I had never seen before. The dates were familiar. The names were familiar. But what those pages appeared to show made my heart begin to race. For nearly a year, everyone had been asking why I stayed silent. Sitting in that office, staring at official hospital documentation, I finally understood why the truth had been so difficult to find. And I also realized someone was about to have a very hard time explaining it. The hospital administrator allowed me several minutes to review the documents without interruption. The room was completely silent except for the sound of pages turning. As I moved through the records, the story that had dominated my life for nearly a year began unraveling line by line. Every major communication regarding my mother's care had been logged. Phone calls. Contact updates. Notification requests. Authorized family representatives. Escalation notes. The records revealed something shocking. During the earliest weeks of my mother's hospitalization, multiple requests had been submitted instructing staff to direct certain updates through Diane before contacting other family members. More importantly, the logs showed repeated instances where hospital employees attempted to reach me but were informed that information had already been relayed. According to the documentation, messages intended for me had often been intercepted within the family communication chain long before they reached my phone. The administrator carefully explained that hospitals rely heavily on family-provided contact structures. Staff members generally assume authorized relatives are acting in good faith. They document what they are told. They follow established communication preferences. They are not responsible for managing family conflicts behind the scenes. Then she showed me something even more significant. Visitor records, care coordination notes, and appointment attendance logs created a timeline that directly contradicted the narrative everyone had accepted. The evidence showed I had been present far more frequently than people claimed. Certain appointments supposedly handled entirely by Diane included documentation noting my participation. Tasks credited to others often contained records connecting them to me. The administrator wasn't accusing anyone of fraud or misconduct. She was simply showing me what the hospital's records objectively reflected. For the first time in months, I wasn't relying on memory. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't arguing. I was looking at institutional documentation created in real time by people with no personal stake in our family drama. I asked for certified copies. The administrator provided everything I was entitled to receive. Then she said something I will never forget. She told me that documentation cannot always reveal motives, but it often reveals patterns. And patterns tell stories people don't expect. A week later, an extended family gathering brought nearly everyone together. Under normal circumstances, I would have avoided it. This time I attended intentionally. The familiar conversations began almost immediately. Diane occupied the center of attention as usual. Relatives praised her dedication. Several people discussed how difficult caregiving had been. Then someone repeated the accusation that had followed me for months. They remarked that not everyone had stepped up when my mother needed support. The room grew quiet. Everyone knew what was being implied. For the first time, I didn't change the subject. Instead, I calmly opened my folder and placed several documents on the table. Confusion spread across the room. I explained that I had recently completed a formal review of hospital records related to my mother's treatment. Then I began walking through the timeline. No anger. No insults. No dramatic speeches. Just dates, logs, attendance records, communication notes, and documented facts. Every claim was supported by paperwork. Every accusation met evidence. The atmosphere changed almost immediately. Relatives who had confidently repeated rumors suddenly became very interested in reading documents for themselves. Questions started emerging. Difficult questions. Why had certain updates never reached me? Why did attendance records conflict with family stories? Why did communication logs show information being routed through specific people? Nobody needed me to answer. The records answered on their own. Across the room, Diane's confidence disappeared. For the first time since this nightmare began, she had no explanation prepared. No sympathetic phrasing. No carefully crafted concern. Just silence. The most emotional moment came when my mother slowly reviewed several pages herself. She read quietly for a long time. Then she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. It wasn't a dramatic television moment. There were no grand declarations. Just a painful realization settling into place. She finally understood that the daughter everyone called heartless had never abandoned her at all. The lie hadn't collapsed because I exposed it. The lie collapsed because the truth had been documented long before anyone thought to look for it. The weeks that followed weren't about revenge. They were about rebuilding. Trust doesn't return overnight simply because the truth comes out. My mother and I had lost nearly a year to misunderstandings, half-truths, and assumptions. There was sadness in that realization, but there was also relief. For the first time in a long time, we were finally working from the same set of facts. We started spending more time together without discussing the conflict at all. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with explanations. Sometimes it begins with quiet moments that remind people who they were before the damage started. As for the rest of the family, their attitudes changed naturally once the evidence became impossible to ignore. Some apologized directly. Others never found the words. I didn't push either way. My goal had never been to win an argument. It was simply to stop living inside a story that wasn't true. Looking back, the most important lesson wasn't that lies eventually fail. It was that patience matters. When people underestimate you, there is power in staying calm long enough for the facts to speak for themselves. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do or watched others believe a false story about you, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional justice stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me for the next story.